Good evening. Welcome to the Human Services Committee meeting for Monday, November 5th, 2018. We have a quorum, so we are going to get started. I'm going to move that we approve the minutes from October 1st, 2018.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
All right, any opposed? All right, motion carries. Citizen comment in this committee goes along with the topic. So we have two speakers who are signed up to speak about police matters, so we will take you when we get to the police issue. Actually, I guess it's the first thing. We don't have any. Actually, I'm going to do HH2 first because I think that's a little bit shorter. So, Ike, can we have you do the rodent control update first, please?
Good day, honourable members of the committee. I provided a memo. I just want to know if there are any questions in regards to the report. No questions?
Alderman Fisk.
It's just we're moving in the right direction.
Absolutely, we are moving in the right direction. Our numbers are low, thanks to all the efforts that we've actually put in, and thanks for everyone who's contributed. So it's going really, really well with our pest control operators. As you know, we went back to them after we had some issues with Smithereen, and now they're back and they're doing wonderfully well. So no issues there, and the numbers are down. So I'm really, really excited about that.
Do we a ticket for overflowing garbage cans?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We do.
Who issues those tickets?
So that's us. It is. So it's something that we also do with Public Works. Depending if it's a special pickup, they tag it. Overflowing garbage, we also deal with it as well. So it's something that both departments work on.
Okay.
All right, seeing no more comments, thank you very much for the report.
No problem.
All right, next we will have our two speakers as we move on to item HH1, which is the police department review presentation. Mr. Rinsky. You will have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I think you brought a point about the budget in the police department in this report. My issue is this report is a year late in happening. If you're dealing with a budget, why weren't you looking at this a year ago? Why would you let the city manager to basically adjust police staffing levels in the community without any discussion? I mean, are we awake here? That's the question, because as I read this report, we were at 8, we went to 10, and, back to 10 and 8, and it seems like there were problems. Just like with the health department. We had people come up here, because that's part of this committee, and say, oh, well, we couldn't have a health department because we were cutting things. So it seems to me, it's just I'm paying $25,000 for a report, and I'm in the middle of a budget crisis, and I don't know what I'm doing. Because at the end of the day, this report doesn't do anything to help you make a decision on the budget, and that's a problem. That's the issue. I mean, what has the city manager done to basically make you make a decision? He just wants to do what he wants to do to make the numbers. And he did the same thing with the health department. And I'm sorry, this is not the way to do business. I mean, he really should have done this a year ago, and we should have had a discussion at that time. And that's how it should be done. And I'm sorry, if you can't figure that out and you're going to keep letting him do this with everything, we're going to have more and more problems. And I warn you, in 2020, the budget crisis is just as big, and it's not getting fixed, and he won't fix it. And I mean, and the other thing, his authority, and we can talk about that, he does not have the authority to do everything he claims he can do. You're running the city. You can tell him what to do. I mean, I went and got the statutes from the city. The statutes don't give him the authority to tell you what to do. So I think you better start deciding what you want to do here. You better demand a lot more out of him. When he comes and does things, get the numbers and demand the numbers, and don't make a decision until you have the numbers. Because frankly, I don't know what's going on, and the police will affect the poor. If the police staffing levels are wrong, you'll have problems, and you'll have more problems and more problems. So just think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kirby?
Madam Chair, if I can do a preamble, if she's the only speaker, she's the consultant.
Oh, you're the consultant. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were the speaker. All right, Mr. City Manager.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good evening. I'm happy to be here tonight to have representatives from Hillard Hines, the company that was contracted with the city, to do a review of some specific points of our police department. And in a moment, I'll introduce Deborah Kirby, who is the Chief Legal Officer for Hillard Hines and was the leader of the team that performed the study. As the council will recall, a year ago, as we were looking at the budget, as we were looking at potential changes needed in the budget, the council allocated $25,000 to do a study that would be as focused and targeted as possible to look at issues at the police department. I'm pleased with the way this report has come out. I think it helps focus my attention, Chief Eddington's attention, and perhaps most importantly, the new Chief of Police's attention, who will be coming on board here in a few months, on some issues that we'll be facing as we move forward with the police department. Decision-making, policy-making is never something that is done in a vacuum. It is done over a long period of time. The Evanston Police Department has been here for over 100 years, and God willing, will be here for another 100 years, serving the residents of Evanston. So I think this report is very timely. I think it provides a good framework to look at issues that we're facing. And in talking with Chair Fleming earlier this evening, I think it's an opportunity for additional discussions. This is not meant to be a report to be put on a shelf. This is a report to help us as we continue to move forward with the police department. In working with Hillard Hines, we had some indication through the budget process of some issues that would be raised, and I think there are changes that are proposed in the budget that reflect a portion of them. But as you'll hear in a few moments, the recommendations are a little bit more far-reaching, and I think would be appropriate for further discussion at this committee. Certainly, we'll make this report available to our candidates for Chief of Police, as well as the candidate that is selected, to really take this information and him or her have that ability to build on that. So, Madam Chair, unless there's any initial questions of the committee, I'd like to introduce Deborah Kirby from Hillard Hines, who will give a brief presentation of the report.
Okay, I think Alderman Fisk, did you have a question? Okay. Okay, Ms. Hines.
Ms. Kirby?
Ms. Kirby.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to being able to answer any questions that you might have. Based upon that, our presentation is very brief. I find that death by PowerPoint doesn't do anybody any well. So our report is titled Supporting Excellence and Efficiency in the Delivery of Police Services. And we really felt that during our time here in Evanston, we really identified a goal and a desire to make sure that the delivery services in this community met community expectations. As far as Hillard Hines, we are Chicago-based. We're internationally known. We're a security risk management firm that covers a range of issues from law enforcement through threat violence risk management training. So we cover a broad panoply of actions that we undertake here in Chicago and elsewhere across the country. As it relates to law enforcement practice, we have conducted dozens of assessments in law enforcement agencies across America, from large cities such as San Francisco down to the smallest with St. Anthony's Village with 22 police officers. So our realm of experience and background on law enforcement, where they stand, how they're structured, what are some of the priorities and what are some of the challenges facing law enforcement today, is based not only upon our local experience, the experience of our team, many of whom have been prior law enforcement executives, but also based upon our on-the-ground experience in cities across America. Your team here visibly consisted of myself, Deborah Kirby. I am currently the Chief Legal Officer for Hillard Hines, but I was brought in 3 years ago to tee up their practice when it came to the collaborative reform initiative under the COPS office. Across America, 9 cities, we were brought into those cities to help address issues, usually post a bad incident, public shooting event, or some other charged event that put the community up in arms. My partner on this project was James Hickey. He is also a well-respected subject matter expert in law enforcement. Both of us are originally from the Chicago Police Department. Jim had a dual experience experience in terms of that he was civilian and sworn. And the later part of his career was really focused on technology, policy, and engaging with local communities and sharing data and information. So that was your team here. Behind the scenes, we are supported by a wide range of expertise and support, including people who have had experience in chief in the suburbs of Chicago, large city chiefs. We've got state experience, technical experience, as well as project management experience. We were retained to conduct a high-level assessment of the Evanston Police Department. And this is important to prioritize today in our conversation because generally when we would do an assessment of an organization, we're there for a period of months doing a lot of detailed data information. Based on the desires of the city and the department, we came in and really kind of focused on what we knew to be those hot topic areas and really to look at them from a high-level perspective and say, okay, what's happening in this organization? What makes it work? And what are some of the challenges it faces? We reviewed data and documents provided by the department, and we interviewed a range of internal stakeholders and some of the external city partners to the organization. This is not a public-facing event or assessment. It was not intended to be early on. What we did was we took the information that we were able to develop, and then we benchmarked it against what we knew to be national, local, and other types of practices in terms of the, how would you say, the professional groups associated with law enforcement, including IACP, PERF. They all have acronyms, but they all mean something to law enforcement generally. What we came away with from our event here is that we really did not encounter any low-hanging fruit. That's a good thing in terms of being able to validate what your police practices are, but it's also a challenging thing because as we're aware, you're coming into a budget process and there are concerns about what the budget is. Normally, law enforcement is one of your larger consumers of the city budget, and so any type of cut that you can make to a law enforcement or police department is one that generally benefits the coffers of the city. But we also have the experience of knowing that those types of decisions and where and how to cut within an organization usually need to be driven by a strategic process. And so normally what we see with law enforcement departments is that sometimes the strategic plan of that organization is not always fully effectuated. And so as we start to make cuts to an organization, it looks at placement of bodies and, just take that. Our job here was at a high level to show what were some of the interconnectivities between those units and perhaps where efficiencies or greater effectiveness could occur. We also provide, as a result of our report, which I know that has been shared, a level of nuance around the budget planning, and our goal here is really to maximize return on investment, not from a budget perspective, because we leave that to you, but truly from a law enforcement perspective and saying, okay, what do my officers do, and how can I make sure that I'm getting the best value out of them? The one thing I do need to note, particularly because I stand before council, is that there is a typo in my report. We identified 8 wards in the city of Evanston. We know that there are 9, and so the report will be updated to reflect that typo. So in advance, our reports are not normally, we do a great deal of due diligence in making sure our reports are accurate, but I have a feeling that my reviewer got confused by 8 beats and 8 wards. So I apologize to whomever was left off in that. Hopefully nobody identified here. When we look at it from a high-level view, though, there's 3 things that stick out as this organization goes forward, right? And so you have professionalism. Notwithstanding some of the challenges that all law enforcement agencies have from time to time, this organization really struck us as a professional organization and one that had a level of commitment throughout the organization to its people. As we talked to commanders and other department members, the nuance of what it meant to be a law enforcement officer in Evanston really came through, and it came through repeatedly. And so that is something that I think that demonstrates the strength of your organization. You're in a transition period. For any law enforcement agency, transition is hard, right? As you go from one leader to the next. It's particularly so for Evanston because of Chief Eddington's tenure here. 11 years is highly unusual in law enforcement these days. And so as Chief Eddington leaves, so does a level of historical knowledge that the chief will take with him and his ability to know where and exactly what in that organization he needs to tweak to make that run. And so your new chief coming in will have to to get up to speed pretty quick, and we hope that this report will help inform them. And then finally, as you look at this organization going forward, clearly one of the areas that law enforcement generally looks at in terms of trying to drive that efficiency, making sure that they're making the mark in terms of what the strategies and goals are the use of technology, right? Being able to identify who, what, where, why. Those are very basic things that way long ago when I was a cop I used to be able to do. But technology gives us a different angle on these now because it helps me to validate, just as we do anywhere else. It helps me to validate what are my decisions, how are my decisions working through, and creates that continuous improvement loop that we're starting to see grow as law enforcement becomes more of a professional. So in terms of what I'm talking about today, we're just going to talk about the top key findings, and then if you have any questions, I'll answer those. But, number one was ensure that supervisory staffing is more consistent across the department. What we saw here were variations in supervisory staffing, and that becomes important because it goes to one, risk issues, right? Why do we have supervisors? Because law enforcement officers have great capacity to make significant decisions that affect lives and well-beings of many people. And so strong supervision generally equates to decreased risk. It also helps to ensure that officers are doing the right thing at the right time consistently. And it provides a continuation of the vision of leadership of the chief. We had one unit where there was no supervisor, no sergeant, all the way to another unit which had one supervisor for 4 officers. And so there's some variation there. Again, it's not numbers to numbers, because if that was strictly what it was, then it would be math and you would need to hire somebody like me. But at the end of the day, it's looking at what is the value that that supervision brings and what is the return on the investment. And so because there is that there was a wide swing of variance, that does become one of our key findings. It also addresses to the level of command staff that the organization has as well. And looking at and saying, are we getting the biggest value out of the placement of a commander in a unit where, there's one other person or 2 other sergeants? And so those are things that organizationally we raise as an issue. The second one is, as I just said, is assess the size and the function of the command staff. There are variations of duties that are attached to other organizations. For example, the executive officer within the chief's office, he runs what is known as their intelligence or the weekly deployment meeting, and yet that individual doesn't have control over the line staff that develops the information that informs that. Again, there's organizational reasons for that, but is it the most effective and efficient way to run that organization? The other one is the organizational structure in light of overall goals. And so when we look at what is the organization itself trying to achieve, already internally, and I have to give credit because there's an intermingling of ideas here, because as we started looking at ideas, there were things that the department was already talking about. So it's not like we come here colloquial, we come brilliant and totally informed, but it was working through a lot of interviews with the organization. But things such as whether or not the Juvenile Bureau, does that become part of the the Investigations Bureau, and allow thereby greater synergy, ideally, to address a range of crime issues. On the flip side of that, by consuming or subsuming your juvenile investigations unit into a larger investigations unit, will that necessary practice and focus on juvenile, the issue of reform still be present? And so those become tough decisions, but on their face, they create certain levels of efficiency, because by combining the 2 units, ideally you're able to reduce one supervisor for other duties. You're also able to look at the overall caseload to say, can I share this caseload? And long-term, ideally, you have a unit fully trained on juvenile issues, which, as we know, the vulnerability of our juvenile youth, whether they're offenders or victims, are a very important thing in law enforcement these days. Under number 3 is that when we're looking at the organizational structure and what that means for the department in terms of its strategic goals, and, do you need the Office of Professional Standards and an executive officer? In some ways, the Office of Professional Standards stands for a very specific thing and has a very specific link and visuality for the community. But can that function also be performed under one command rather than 2? The good news for Evanston is that you have a relatively low complaint rate, but again, it becomes a question of what is it that the department wants to put forward to the community, and how do we communicate those roles? Number 4, as we looked at it, technology. And again, We have a tendency not to really just say technology, because I think that's the answer that everybody brings. Technology is a solution. And it's not. It's a tool. And it's a tool that helps you get to the solution. And so how technology is used and how it's managed is very important in organizations. For example, in Evanston, you've invested in technology for case management, RMS, what they call record management system. Some of that has been automated. Some of it's still paper-based. Full automation and full use of that system, ideally, would generate efficiencies and create better data for the organization overall. Again, those are things that organizationally can be taken under advisement now and move forward, but then we also know that technology grows and advances. And so what are those things that help us get the visibility that we need, the transparency in data? You're also doing good things here in Evanston around technology and data. You have the data initiative where you're sharing a lot of police data publicly without having to go through detailed FOIA requests, et cetera. And so that is a good thing. It also drives the internal accountability and visibility of the organization around these key issues, such as use of force, traffic crashes, stops. And so that starts to create that public debate. So, technology is a tool, but it's also a means of communicating. And within Evanston, where you have a very engaged community that seeks to have a better understanding and better knowledge of policing practices, the better technology is leveraged. I think overall, that reassurance and, frankly, conversation about what is acceptable under police practices and what I want my police to do becomes easier to have. Under number 5, kind of to segue from my technology, is establishing a strategic plan for community outreach and engagement. The EPD has a heavy investment in its problem-solving team, and they engage in a lot of activities across the board for this city. Whether those activities are too many or whether or not they're strategic and tied to goals and outcomes, there's a variety of demands, and whether those demands are driven by what the city needs, what the department needs, or whether or not they're things that are bespoke or special interest. Regardless, we've seen to a person that most people really like the PST team. They're very engaged, they're very knowledgeable, but do the realm of programs that they're doing benefit and continue to drive the success of the brand of the EPD and support citizens, residents in the city in terms of what they want from their police department. And then finally, we put at the end, and we didn't do this in any way that was, it's always challenging when you're a consultant saying, oh, you need further work. But a staffing study would be advised here. And we wrote this report with the idea of creating a strategic roadmap for a new chief. It's been many years since there's been a full-blown staffing assessment of what the department does, what it's required to do, and what it needs to do. As we started to look at the data, you have a relatively low assignment of investigations to your detectives, right? So I think it averaged for across the board about 1 per week. That's great, right? I mean, that's a good thing. But are we then staffed appropriately and efficiently in that area, or do we need to move some of those resources to do something else? Do we need more community outreach? Do we need more intelligence development? What are those things that we need to do? Another area that you're looking at is that for your beats, you have disparity in calls for service amongst your beats. Again, at the top level, okay, it's high, readjust. But then as you go down into that data, which is what a full-blown staffing analysis does, what are the basis for those calls? What are those calls? And do they really warrant different staffing across those beats? And so those are some of the things. But at a very high level, if you look at your staffing, you look at your beats, and you start to rearrange, ideally there's synergy and efficiencies that come. Sometimes you reduce beats, that reduces minimum mannings, minimum staffing requirements, and so there's a realm of action that come out there. But as part of our report, we identified ways to do so without a consultant. You send command members and sergeants to development schools. They can take that on as a project. It's not overly challenging, but you also can partner here. You've got the school staff and command, and ideally, because you are Evanston and they are Evanston, that type of relationship can be developed there as well. But there's a variety of things to do, but minimally, when the new chief comes in, the idea of looking at where your resources are and where are they best spent, we believe brings significant value to this organization. As I said, this was going to be swift. The report, you've been given the copy of that, and I am more than willing at this point to answer any questions that you may have regarding what we submitted.
Alderman Fisk.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the city manager for the report. I found it incredibly helpful, and not only helpful, but also clear. And that's very useful to this committee. I'm sorry that we're losing our chief, but I do think this is very useful in sort of taking a snapshot in time and informing our new chief of a road forward. So I'm just very glad that we did this. So whosever idea it was, Wally, and I'm going to give you credit for that. Chief, I'm going to give you credit for that as well. It was very useful to me, and I'm imagining to the rest of the committee.
Thank you.
All right, I have some questions which are for you or maybe even the chief. So I did speak to the city manager about this, and actually he and I had spoke last year about trying to get this done, and I wish I did have the forethought to push it a little faster, because it would have been interesting to have this before we were in the throes of the budget. I think Mr. Rinsky was right about that. So I think what I would like to see is us to bring this back when we have a new chief, so maybe in February after they have a chance to get their feet wet. But I'm very interested, I guess, in a couple things you mentioned. One was I think you called it records management, the technology we
Yes.
invested in, and it seems to be some are using it and some are not.
Yes.
I would just say that, I would hope that the new chief is going to implement everyone to use it. I think if we've invested into a system that we think is worthwhile, particularly in this day of technology, it's, worthwhile and everyone should be using it. I guess I have a question. I don't know if you can elaborate on the executive officer versus the OPS. I also am unclear as to, I guess I'll just say I'm unclear as to why we have an executive officer. And in OPS, can you elaborate on your mention here about adding a detective? And I think you have it under like professional development
Right.
opportunities. And I guess I want to hear more about that. I'm really pay attention to OPS and the complaints that come in. And so how would that detective kind of help that department, being, as you mentioned, we don't have as many complaints, and we already have, I think, 3 people in there. And so how would the detective help that department and not just be kind of a training tool?
Right. So I think it's dual. So the executive officer is easy enough to answer, and I'll do that really quick. And if I'm wrong, the chief will correct me. Most police departments, this is a mid-sized police department, if you think about them as mini corporations, the executive officer is the party that can sit there and ensure that the the day-to-day direction of the chief is accounted for and taken out throughout the organization. It really takes a burden off the chief in terms of that hands-on management, so that the chief can engage across a variety of units, people, and responsibilities. In this department, the executive officer also runs the weekly deployment meeting and also is serving as the PIO. So, and then as part of there's other taskings that fall to this executive officer. So it is a critical role, and most law enforcement agencies now have moved to that because of the responsibilities that we place upon chiefs. As we look at the Office of Professional Standards, our recommendation is really grounded in the fact that within the chief's office in its entirety, you have an executive officer, which is command level. You have a commander of OPS, you have 2 sergeants, and you have 2 civilian members. And so when we look at OPS with, a relatively low caseload, and even with the use of force investigations that they undertake, the question becomes, are 2 sergeants necessary here, and are 2 command officers necessary? And again, it goes to, well, are we weakening OPS, or are we strengthening it? And by placing a detective into OPS, you could free up 1 or 2 sergeants to do other duties. But I also note that within the Office of Professional Standards, the sergeants that is currently there, one of those sergeants is really what they identify as the compliance sergeant. And so that's the person that makes all the mandatory training, all the risk issues to the organization are covered. That sergeant also manages a lot of the training responsibilities. I think that the challenge of putting that institutionally under OPS is that it makes training somehow be equated to discipline. And that's not necessarily the case. I think in robust organizations, identifying training needs as they feed upon, investigations and complaints is a goal. And so I think that there's some good roots here, but the question going forward is that if we are facing significant budget concerns, and if not this year, then in 2020, is there an opportunity here to realter, reassign some of the personnel currently in this office and still maintain that same level of functionality?
Okay, thank you. So to go to the PST team, I appreciate that you all made the reference, I think, for one officer per 2 wards.
Yes.
I'm one of the wards I'm Ward 9 that was left off, but, I have a PST officer who's a lovely lady, but I don't really have much need for her. I don't have, a lot of crime and such, so I kind of see her once a month at my ward meeting. So I think that would be something that I would, again, recommend the new chief to look into. Just, as you said, to make sure we're being efficient. And then my other, comment had to do with the SRO. So can you elaborate a bit more on your findings with the school resource officer?
So it really becomes, what is the contextual placement of the school resource officer? And are they an extension of the department's engagement with youth and therefore seen as a youth resource? Or are they part of the organizational's vision and commitment to community? It's a fine division, and it's not to say that it's right or wrong on either side, but they really handle a minimal number of investigations. And do we want to place a school resource officer into our schools who's seen as investigating the students? And in some communities, that's fine. In some communities, it's not. The distinction of placing them into the problem solving, because as you identified, there's a disparity in terms of the use of officers. And frankly, some of the officers are taken away from, how would you say, community-facing issues to develop things such as websites and flyers and presentations and doing some of the administrative support around those programs. And so can we more effectively use one officer across 2 districts or 2 wards and then provide back office support, be it through civilian or other officer support, so that it levels that, the ability to engage. But when we talk about school resource officers, the other thing, too, though, is that for most organizations, when the schools are closed, those become more or less floating resources. And how do you maximize those use of those? And so when, from my perspective and the team's perspective, when we're looking at an SRO as a community member or a community team member, that means that during Christmas break or summer break, there's the possibility of facilitating what are some of the after-school events and making sure that we have a police presence at some of the community events that are primarily focused on youth. And so that becomes the decision point there as to whether or not they're more closely aligned to community services or if they're aligned to investigative services.
I think that's all my questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions? No. Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Chief, do you mind? I have a couple questions for you. So I remember last month, we talked about the new police dashboard and how we were going to be implementing that instead of, and so I've taken a look at it, and I appreciate that it has more stuff on there, and unless I'm on the wrong link, it's just not presented in the best way, I guess I'll say. And I know you're not our IT person, but before it kind of had some graphs and stuff that was a little more easy to read. Now it's like a very data-heavy page where you have to kind of click around and figure stuff out. So I guess my direction to you and the city manager, or question is, are we going to get this data into a little bit of an easier viewing, or is this our final product here?
It is, Alderman, is not the final product. It continues to be a work in progress. We're hoping it's in a more presentable state by the December 3rd meeting. Every week, Commander Glue and Hillary from IT work on this, and it's been through several iterations as we try to combine some data that has to be hand collected and some data that's automatically dumped in, and then also making the theory was always to make it visually attractive, and I know we're not at that point yet.
Okay, that's good to know. And then my other question had to do back with the records management piece.
Yes.
Can you just explain a little more what technology we have and if you plan to, or why it's not used across the board? I know in the report there was some mention of something like in an Excel spreadsheet. I know we went through this with our administrative adjudication, trying to get everything in one platform.
I will, but if I may, I want to contextualize some of the excellent work done by Ms. Kirby, and if I can use a military analogy, she's the pilot who flew the SR-71 Blackbird over the jurisdiction, and I'm the ground commander who's been here 12 years. We're going to see things differently. And there's some professional disagreements, and once again, I've been experienced in working for you and understand the demands of the community and the expectations of the community getting answers quickly. And so in that context, there's going to be some shifts in perceptions of what is being suggested for the new chief to pursue. And so I think that this snapshot that you've been given is one that's important, relevant, and will be a guidepost to measure future progress against. Specifically to the RMS, that is one of the discoveries made by Commander Jody Wright and Ms. Kirby's team as they work through this. Commander Wright is in the process of, and the focus point of Ms. Kirby's comments was on the use of that by investigators and the ability to see the case status across those two units. And as we're following what has been laid out already in this budget, the elimination of the juvenile commander, the need for the only commander who's left to have access to all those cases and look at them quickly will require all investigators to use the RMS system, which Commander Wright has instituted and is going forward with.
Okay, so to make sure I understand you, so the plan is to get everything in the RMS. That's our, is that what you're saying?
I think in the context of the Hillard Hines report prepared by Ms. Kirby, the focus of the RMS comments dealt with the investigative units. And so, yes, we're moving the investigative units onto that platform.
Okay, and so do the other units not, being obviously I don't use RMS, so do the other units already use RMS? Is it not for the other units? Is it only for the investigative unit?
No, it's the department-wide. Patrol is heavily invested in the RMS units. For instance, when one of the aldermen, from time to time, we have these conversations about specific addresses. The people who are gathering the information for me are going to the RMS system to get a download on that address. So Patrol is already heavily engaged in that, as is the 911 system.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for the chief? All right, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Chair, could I have a moment, please?
2 minutes, Miss Esther.
Thank you. Good evening. I didn't read it totally, but I browsed through the report that Ms. Kirby just went over and was kind of surprised, well, not surprised, but looked at it and saw that this is a document that is going to be given to our next chief of police, whoever he may be. This is something that we want you to carry forward. And in that document was the thing that, okay, we chatted with people in the community, we chatted with staff and everything, but I didn't see any response or anything from the community as to what they thought or how they felt. And this is another instant of something being pushed on us. And looking at that and looking at through, as they say, an equitable lens, it's not benefiting us, the Black people, in terms of, we say we have less complaints, but nobody ever asked, why do you have less complaint? I have heard from in some staff, meaning policemen and stuff inside, well, a lot of investigation, they don't have the complaint. The sergeant make that decision out in the field. So those numbers are not being tracked. So we don't know what it is that the people are getting when you're not tracking it. So bringing in another report or something to do. If you look at it, also kind of correlate with the Citizen Complaint Assessment Committee, what they have been working on and what they're talking about. So it need to be mushed together and something happen in the community for a broad discussion before it's implemented.
Okay, thank you. So you weren't here in the beginning where Ms. Kirby did say that this was not a report that was done with the community. This was an assessment internally. And we also, I mentioned as the chair that this would be something that we're going to bring back in February after we have a new chief, after they've had hopefully like a month on the job, to have a bigger discussion about this. Is not something that we are just looking at and putting to the side. There will be some things that we, as a council or as a committee, will be working with the new chief to implement, but we also need to get the new chief here and hired and in the job. So this is not something that I see us just rolling out without more thought. This was just the introduction tonight, but
But it has a lot of indication with the budget and the staffing that we will be.
it does, and we are going to work on that with the new chief. However, we're not also going to just give the new chief this document and say move forward. There will be a lot of input. At least I will have a lot of input. Because everything in here can't be done overnight, nor have we decided that we need to do everything in here. I'm very interested in a staffing review, which she mentioned. I think you weren't here. Having a staffing review so we can make sure we have the right number of staff in the right positions. So there is a bigger discussion that will happen. Alderman Fisk?
Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you for those remarks. That was basically what I was going to hope that you were going to say. There's not a. This report is a piece of what we need to consider. I mean, that's what it is, and I want to be really careful that we don't feed into the idea that there's something being pushed on the community or that something is more than what it appears to be. So I was glad that you explained that. And I just want to keep everyone focused on this is a process. This is one piece in the process, and I think a very helpful piece in the process. But please don't read too much into that this is somehow we're an evil cabal trying to push something on the public without public input, because that's not what this report is. The other thing that I wanted to say just really briefly about it was what Chief said about the 30,000-foot view and his role on the ground. It's one of the things where I think consultant reports are really helpful, because it takes that 30,000-foot view, but then the chief has taken that and applied it to Evanston as he sees it, and as he sees it through all of the communications from staff and the public and his officers, and I think has done a really good job with that. So while it's helpful to have a consultant's report, I don't think anyone in Evanston would expect us to accept a consultant's report as being the final say, and that we must do what the consultant says. It's a guideline and suggestions, and we'll tailor it to be our own.
And just for clarity for Ms. Esther and those who maybe weren't here, this is also something that this report as well as what the community police, whatever the group is called, I'm not sure, the community assessment, police review, or whatever it's called, that will also be something that we are expecting the new chief to understand and to implement, because that is done by the community. So that's something that will also be passed on to the new chief. All right, seeing no more lights. Mr. City Manager, can I ask you to give a quick update, please, on where we are with the hiring and interviewing of the new chief?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, we are moving forward. We will be having interviews next week. It is our hope from those interviews that we'll get one or two top candidates, and hopefully an appointment will be made before the end of the year, hopefully before Christmas.
And those people who applied to be on the committee, have they been notified?
They have been.
Okay, thank you. All right, seeing no further lights, we have any items for communication? Alderman Ravel?
Just to mention that on everybody's desk, there was a small packet from Faye Clayton and Missy Fleming, who came before us a couple of meetings ago from Compassion and Choices to talk about their proposal. And they're not looking to be on our agenda till sometime after the first of the year, but they put together some information that addresses the questions that members of the committee had. And in particular, one of the questions was why is a resolution from our city council important to the effort? So they've addressed that in here.
Okay, thank you. And I have one item. So this, I would like to make sure that this report, as well as the CPAC, the CPAC report, are back on the agenda for Human Services in February. I know CPAC is coming next month.
Yes, they're coming next month.
Okay, all right. So if we can have that one back on the agenda for February, March, maybe we'll start with the Hines report for February to start the discussion with the new chief. And then also I would like to ask for a report to come, and this can be in January, from the General Assistance and Emergency Assistance Department. I would like an end of the year report that shows how many clients we helped, how many clients were denied from service. I also would like to know where we think most of the referrals are coming from, and where we refer clients who we are unable to help here. Also, sorry, one more question. The demographics of the clients, in particular ages and where they're coming from around the city. All right, so seeing nothing further, I move that we adjourn this meeting.
So moved.
And we will start city council in 10 minutes, so that's 5 minutes after 7.